Welcome to episode 48 of Sport SA Daily Diary. Today we're chatting to legendary American cyclist George Hincapie. Morning, George. Well, afternoon for us, morning for you. How's it going?
Good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, no, very well, thank you. How's the lockdown been treating you guys in the US? Bit different from here in South Africa, where you guys can get out.
Yeah, no, we've been obviously everything's closed. Well, things are actually slowly starting to reopen in our state, which I'm not sure if it's a good thing or not. But we, even throughout the lockdown, we've been able to go out biking and been able to work out outside. So that's been helpful.
Nice. George, you've had an unbelievable cycling career. Before we get onto that, quite a strange thing though for a chap who's 6 foot. There's not too many cyclists who are your size.
Well, I mean, I think the average height has come up quite a bit in the last 10, 15 years, and really it's all power to weight. So I don't see being high or being tall or being short as being any kind of you know uh, negative in our sport. It's just a question of how efficient you are on the bike and how you can navigate your way around the peloton, which, in my opinion, is so much. Means so much in the sport of cycling.
Yeah. And you were certainly efficient on the bike. George, were you riding since you were young, from school age, or when did you start falling in love with the sport?
Yeah, I started riding when I was 8 years old and um, raced throughout my school career. It was a family sport for us. It was pretty much the only sport I ever did growing up.
Okay. And when did you see that you were actually pretty damn good and it could be a career for you?
Probably when I was about 12 or 13, I started winning a lot of races. I mean, obviously it's too early to tell if that was a career choice or not for me, but I knew that at that around that age, I knew that that's all I wanted to do, and I was going to focus all I could on that.
And when you decided to turn pro, tell us a bit about that. How did that opportunity come around?
It was not more of me personally decided. I always wanted to, but it was just basically a call I got up from Jim Ockowitz, the current director of CCC, but back then the manager of Motorola, offered me a contract when I was 19 years old, 20 years old, and it was just something that a call that I always wanted to get, and something that I had dreamed of getting that call. So it was just sort of a well, it wasn't sort of, it was a big day in my career that getting that phone call and realizing that I had made the next step.
Yeah. And had you been racing in Europe at this stage? Because cycling wasn't too big in the US. Obviously, there'd been Greg LeMond, and then there was Lance and yourself. But had you been onto the European circuit before then?
I had been racing the World Championships. I was fortunate enough, like with the national team, really put me under their wing and would bring me to international competitions, starting at like 16, 15, 16 years old. So I had kind of experience a bit of racing in Europe. Of course, not living there, which is a completely different scenario. But I had experience racing over there, and that's kind of what caught the attention of Jim Ockowitz then was, how well I was doing in international races and in the pro-ams as well.
Okay. And you spent 2 seasons with Motorola and then went on to join US Postal. How did that change come about?
Well, Motorola went away. They lost their sponsor. And so I was on Motorola 94, 95, 96, actually 3 seasons with them. And then we lost the sponsor. So I was kind of treading water until the late 96 until I got an offer from US Postal Service.
And obviously, you were riding with Lance at this point. I'm not interested in all of the negative media. I still feel Lance was an unbelievable cyclist. You must have had a very close relationship with him.
Yeah, no, we were close from when we were juniors at the national team. And then he was obviously 2 years older than me, so he turned pro earlier. But we kept in close contact, and I'm sure he had a lot to do with me jumping on board on the team with him as well.
Yeah. And tell me, when he got cancer, how did that impact you and some of the other cyclists that were close to him?
Well, it was definitely a very scary time. Just hearing that a close friend was so sick, and not knowing at the time, not knowing anything about the prognosis and what he had to go through, was a lot. It was definitely very worrisome.
Yeah. And George, I mean, you continued. I must say, I'm not the biggest fan of the word domestic because I don't think it actually justifies the strength of riders such as yourself. Um, what do you feel that makes like a team such as U.S. Postal Service to be so successful?
Well, I mean, it's just there's a whole, there's a lot of factors that go into it, whether it's picking the right riders, doing the right planning, just working well as a cohesive unit. There's a lot of things that go into it. And it's just not about like who pulls the most at the front. It's, the person in the car at the time, Johan Brunel, making the calls, to the riders really committing to one goal. I think that all kind of helped in the success.
And George, you thrived on the cobblestone races. Is there any particular reason why? I mean that's a pretty tough form of racing.
Yeah, no, I always kind of just growing up as a kid, all you saw was like, not saw, but all you read about was Paris-Roubaix and the Tour de France. So that's kind of all I knew. So when I first made my debut in like head bulk in the Belgian races in the Paris-Roubaix, I was just full of excitement. There was no fear whatsoever, and I just wanted to prove that I can do well in those sort of races. And I really think just growing up in New York, riding a bike in the city, racing in the city, really helped heighten my sense of awareness in the peloton and on the roads. And even though those road conditions and the weather conditions are quite extreme, I felt like my growing up in the sport and the way I did really helped me kind of prepare for that.
Yeah. And I mean, George, you also had an amazing love affair with the Tour de France, starting 17, finishing 16, which is an unbelievable achievement. Um, was it always a love affair with that specific race, or was it more because that was a focus of the team?
Well, again, similar to Roubaix, it was just it's and it is back then and today. It's still the biggest race in the world, and
Yeah.
I never took for granted that I was actually doing it, and I always wanted to go and do everything I could possibly do to perform well, arrive in shape. Never really took my position on the team for granted, and I always tried to work very hard to peak 2 times a year. That was for Paris Roubaix and the Tour de France, and then of course I would do well in other times of the year, but that was just residual fitness from trying to get ready for those races.
Yeah. And George, with riding all those Tour de France's, you didn't ride too many of the other, or the big two, the Vuelta and the Giro. You finished one Vuelta, but no Giros. Any specific reason why you weren't part of those races?
It's just the way the year worked out for me would be, like I said, try to peak at Paris-Roubaix, and then try to peak for the Tour de France. And all the other races, for me personally, just weren't as important. And it was just too hard to try to do 3 major peaks. And for me, I always liked being at home here in America too. So if I was able to prove to the team that I could race at 100% for Paris-Roubaix and the Tour de France, they never really pushed me to race too much later in the year. I was kind of unique in that sense, where I would race 60 to 70 days a year maximum, where a lot of riders would race 90 to 100 days a year.
Yeah, that's a lot, and a big toll on the body. George, you didn't only ride with Lance, you also rode with Alberto Contador and Cadel Evans, all riders of different strengths and different personalities. Tell us a bit about riding with Cadel and Alberto.
Well, they're all completely different leaders. I mean, the personalities are different, but they all really just had the overwhelming sense of drive to win. That was very similar in all of them. The way they did it was different, but I was fortunate enough to work closely with all 3 of them. Of course, I worked longer with Lance, but got really close with Cadel. I still am very close with Cadel. You saw us in Cape Epic a couple of years ago. We had a good time. And then, of course, Contador was only with him for a year, so I wouldn't say I'm that close with him, but we got along quite well. And in fact, I saw him in Shanghai in a few months ago in November, before all the chaos happened in the world, and it was great to catch up with him. And I feel fortunate that I got to work with him, help him win the Tour de France in 2007, which ironically, when I helped him win the Tour de France, it was 2000, you know, it was 2007. Uh, he he won by like 25 seconds, I think, that year over Cadel Evans. But somehow I luckily got into a breakaway in the Pyrenees, and my only role was to get to the top of the Perisor before Condor caught me, so I can drag him down the hill. So Condor attacked with Rasmussen right before the top. I waited. He caught me right before the KOM line, and then I just bombed the descent with him on his wheel, and we ended up putting in about a 30-second gap on Cadel Evans, and Condor ended up winning the Tour de France by, you know, I think it was under 30 seconds, which was kind of funny. And then 2 years later, I helped Cadel win the Tour, so it was kind of an ironic situation there that I was able to, you know, basically take away Cadel Evans' Tour 1 year and then help him win it the next year.
Yeah. Well, I suppose it shows the importance of cycling. And I mean, if you can maybe just touch on that, because we've seen the dominance of Team Sky over the years. How important is the makeup of the team for a race like the Tour de France?
Oh, it's hugely important. I mean, like I said, it's, you know, I've always been kind of not shocked, but very surprised that you know, Sky has been able, or Ineos now has been able to do it with 1 or 2 leaders. We never really had that situation, but it just proves that, like, with, you know, a budget 2 or 3 times the size of most teams, you're able to get those riders that are, you know, your domestiques are making over 7 figures, and there could be team leaders on any other team. So with the budget they have, they're able to pull off having 2, sometimes 3 leaders in some of these Grand Tours, where back in our day that was impossible.
Yeah. And George, I mean, you weren't only successful in Europe, you also won back home quite a few times. You won 3 US road race championships. What was the competition like when you were racing back there in the US? Was Lance participating in those races as well, or were you kind of the overwhelming favorite?
Yeah, no, it was, the competition was nothing like, I always kind of say the big difference between racing in Europe, well, aside from the competition is greater, but in the US the pelotons are smaller. They're like under 150 guys. Europe's over 200, and the roads are the size of highways in the US, and Europe the size of bike paths. So it's almost a completely different sport. That said, it's still very difficult when we'd come back over and race in the US as the clear favorites, and everybody's kind of, you know, watching you race, and we would usually have smaller teams because most of our team would be racing in Europe. It's still made for very tough racing and very difficult to actually win in those circumstances. So even though I would say the overall competition was less, it was the difficultness of winning was about the same.
Yeah. And I mean, George, you've had an amazing career. You've won all over the place. You've participated in races all over the place. You've ridden in Olympic Games, 5 consecutive Olympic Games, which is incredible. Has there been a moment in your career that's been the highlight?
The highlights. Anytime you cross the Champs-Elysees in Tour de France, just because it's such an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. Of course, winning is always helpful. Winning in my hometown here in Greenville, South Carolina, the national championships was always very special. I got to do that 2 times. No, so it's nothing really other than that stands out. But I was definitely very fortunate to have such a long career and live through so many different phases of the sport of cycling, and really see it change a lot.
Yeah. And George, who is your toughest, or who is the best person that you ever rode with? Was it Lance?
The best person I ever rode with. I mean, Lance and I are super tight. We're like brothers. That's a tough. There's a couple that stand out. I mean, obviously, Mark Cavendish. We're very close, and he was very fun to be around. Cadel, we got very close as well. Christian Vandervelde, who's my neighbor now, and Bobby Julik, who's also my neighbor. We train together all the time now. There's a bunch of guys. Like I said, I mean, I was fortunate to come across a lot of some of the most interesting personalities in the sport, and really form close-knit relationships that I still have with them throughout this day.
And George, as you mentioned a bit earlier, you came across to South Africa a couple of years ago and rode in the Cape Epic. How was that experience for you?
So Cape Epic was super fun. I got to do it 2 times, once with Cadell and then once with Christian Vanderbilt. I'm surprised he still talks to me. But no, it's great. I mean, Cape Epic is, I would recommend it to anybody. If you want to, the ultimate mountain bike experience, that's Cape Epic. It was something that I really, looking back, of course, truly enjoyed. But during the race where you're thinking you're not a professional athlete anymore, why are you taking these risks? Why are you like, pushing yourself so hard? Those questions come into your mind when you're racing that, especially after a long pro career like I had. But it's super fun, and it's the organization, the vibe around the atmosphere around the event is something that I've never really experienced, and I highly recommend it.
And in terms of difficulty level, obviously you can't compare directly, but a sort of a Tour de France, which is almost a month, and an Absa Cape Epic, which is 8 days. Is there a big variance in terms of what it takes out of the body?
It's different. I mean, it's highly, there's a lot of different aspects of the race, but it's still 4 to 6 hours a day on the bike. The pounding that your body receives throughout the day, especially when I did it with Christian, where there's a lot less single track and a lot more rocky, sort of rooty trails. The heat is there, so the elements are quite similar to the Tour de France. The pounding is more similar to a race like Paris-Roubaix, where your body's just taking a pounding throughout the day, and you get a lot more of an upper body workout. So the overall pain is similar to the Tour de France.
Okay. And George, what are you up to these days? What are you still keeping fit on the bike? You riding a lot?
Yeah, no, I don't ride a lot, but I still ride 5 days a week, where I'll do anywhere from 2 to maximum 3 hour rides. I play tennis a couple days a week, and I do some gym work as well. So I still exercise quite a bit. Not like I used to, but I feel like I'm probably overall more fit than when you're a professional biker. Like, just going for long walks, it makes you tired and everything hurts because you're just so used to riding the bike. But now I like to think of myself as a more complete athlete.
But do you miss those competitive edges of pro racing? I mean, do you do any bike races these days and sort of whip everybody just for fun?
Not really. I mean, obviously these days there's no rides or fundos, but when the day comes that we get back to doing grand fundos, and of course I always like to mix it up with the best guys, but I have no delusions that I can ride like in the first group with the pros anymore. That's just a full-time job, and I have no interest in being that fit.
Awesome. George, it's been great to chat to you today on Sport SA Daily Diary. Thank you so much for your time.
My
Good luck
pleasure.
with the rest of the lockdown, and we'll see you again on the road.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, George. Look out for tomorrow's episode of Sport SA Daily Diary, where we'll be chatting to legendary South African cricketer Shaun Pollock.